Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. I'm a member of ASA. Membership costs me just $50 Australian a year. By being a member, I receive a regular newsletter. I find out information about upcoming conferences, funding opportunities, calls for papers. So I encourage you to think about becoming a member of ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Okay, well, once again this week we're in the beautiful city of Hobart in Tasmania. And this week I'm joined by Professor Elizabeth Leane. Listeners know that I get a lot wrong. Professor Elizabeth Leane, but Elle is preferred way of introducing our guest. So Elle is Professor of English and an ARC Future Fellow at the University of Tasmania. And today we're going to discuss her article, American Cows in Antarctica, Richard Byrd's Polar Diary as Symbolic Settler Colonization. How do you pronounce
Colonialism.
it? Colonialism.
And actually, it's dairy, not diary. That was a problem we had throughout the article, Dairy Diary.
Yes, it's an unusual name, isn't it?
Well, it's Byrd, Richard Byrd is the explorer.
Okay.
We're thinking about, in Antarctica, you're almost always talking about people's diaries, but in this case, we're talking about his dairy.
Okay, of course, his dairy, yes. And it was published in the Journal of Colonialism and Colonial History in 2017. And we must give a shout out to the co-author, Hanne Nielsen, who isn't here, but of course made a wonderful contribution to the piece and hopefully will be future guests on Knowing Animals. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Siobhan.
Okay, so why this piece? Where did it come from?
Yeah, it's a bit of a long story, really. I do a lot of work on Antarctic cultural history, representation of Antarctica in literature. And as part of that, I became interested in human-animal relations in Antarctica. It's a super interesting place in that regard because, there are no land mammals in Antarctica. The biggest animals are midge. There's no indigenous people. So when humans first came to Antarctica, it put them in a very interesting position in terms of their relationship with animals, both native animals like penguins, marine mammals, but also the introduced animals they brought with them. So I'd been doing research on various aspects of this. So I'd looked at penguins in film and so forth. I'd looked at dogs on expeditions. I'd even looked at krill with a marine biologist. And I knew that there had been an episode involving cows in the 1930s, and I'd always been intrigued by it. It seemed like such a strange thing to do, to take cows to Antarctica. But I'd never managed to get hold of the original material to do something with that story. And then Hanne, who was my postgraduate student at the time, had gone to the American Geographical Society Library in the US. She had a fellowship to do a completely different project. But while she was there, she said to me, I found this strange box in the archives about cows. And I said, Hanne, photocopy everything. So she did, and she brought it back. And Hanne then wrote an article herself it's got the fantastic title of Hoof Prints in Antarctica, which is about the kind of media and publicity around these cows. But then I thought, and she thought, that there was more we could do with them, that there was a bigger story to tell. So we began this article about settler colonialism and cows in Antarctica.
Yeah, wonderful. So naturally, I'm sure a lot of listeners will have never thought of cows in Antarctica. How did it happen? How did it come to pass?
Yep. So Richard Byrd was an American explorer, and in the early 1930s, he was going to Antarctica for the second time, leading an expedition. These were private expeditions, so they had a bit of state support, but mostly he had to drum up support through deals, media deals, publicity, private donations, all those sorts of things. On his first expedition, he'd flown over the South Pole, so it had a big kind of dramatic goal. This second expedition, he was having trouble thinking of a kind of hook. So he did a few things. He decided that he would do the first radio program from Antarctica. And at the last minute, he decided to take these cows. And we're fairly sure that the main reason from his point of view was the publicity that attracted, because it was such a strange thing to do. he did a deal with the American Guernsey Cattle Club. So it was good for them, good publicity for them, good publicity for the people who made the milking equipment he took and so forth, but good publicity for his expedition. So that was how they came to go, 3 dairy cows, Guernsey cows. But really there's a bit more to the story, we think, than simply this was a publicity stunt. It was a publicity stunt, but we think it was more than that.
So what was the additional element?
Yeah.
What was the more than that?
Yeah, so that's what we became interested in. So we looked into how, because of course Byrd couldn't say this is a publicity stunt. He had to give an ostensible reason for it. So the ostensible reason that he gave was that there was a milk problem on the expedition, that the men needed milk to be healthy. And this tied into a discourse at the time around milk as a kind of ideal food product. And milk was very much tied, I think, to, I had to do a lot of reading around this area, to middle America and to wholesome Americanness, if you like. So there's a kind of national discourse going on around milk. It was also tied to masculinity. There had been the temperance movement was encouraging men to drink milk rather than alcohol. There was a sense that the wholesome male drank milk to be healthy. So they had to take down this milk was his story. But there was a lot of things that undercut that. One was that a lot of previous expeditions had taken powdered milk and had done just fine. And Byrd had taken powdered milk as well, and his previous expedition done fine. And indeed, this expedition, his second expedition, was sponsored by a powdered milk manufacturer, malted milk manufacturer, William Horlicks. So there really was no issue with milk. That was just an excuse, really. So what other reason might there have been to take these cows? And what we found was that it most closely tied to Byrd's idea of establishing a settlement in Antarctica. So previous Antarctic expeditions, they'd had their expedition huts and their bases, but there wasn't really a sense that they were making a home in Antarctica. But I think Byrd aimed to give the impression, at least, that America was settling Antarctica. This connected with America's approach to colonialism and land claim, that you couldn't claim land unless you had effectively occupied it. It wasn't enough to simply discover it. So if Byrd wanted to make a claim on Antarctica for America, which he did, then he had to be seen to be settling it. And one way of doing that was to look like you were setting up a kind of little farming establishment in the way that America was settled. America was settled by Europeans, partly through the usual colonial techniques of planting crops and bringing cattle and so forth. And so he gives the impression of doing that in Antarctica. Setting up a dairy is a way of saying, okay, we're making a home here, we're making a farm here. So the cows were, I think, his way of trying to make a claim on Antarctica. I mean, that sounds ridiculous, putting it like that, but yeah.
It was really fascinating reading the article, which I very much enjoyed, and the kind of meaning around milk, or the kind of the cultural attributions, given to milk. Are you aware that at the minute there's quite a bit of debate around milk as kind of the drink of the neo-Nazi or the alt-right? There's something about the white, the purity, that's kind of, it's being used once again as a symbol for kind of white person's superiority.
Yeah, I haven't been following that, but it doesn't surprise me at all, because a number of the books that I read around milk at this period had the same argument, that milk was closely tied to whiteness, being a white drink, a drink that white America took as its own in a sense. So, and that very much ties to the white continent, of course. And you don't have to read all that much around Antarctic literature to know there was also a discourse around Antarctic whiteness and race. And in fact, there are ongoing kind of myths around Nazi survival in Antarctica and Hitler's secret base in Antarctica. So that all ties together around. And of course, Byrd's expedition was entirely white, as far as I know. I think the first African American to officially come to Antarctica was in Byrd's third expedition a few years later. So, and most of heroic era expedition was done by white Europeans or Americans or Australasians. So that all kind of ties together. There was a racial dimension to it for sure.
Mm. Well, how did the cows fare?
Not too badly. I mean, in the sense that 3 went down, 2 survived, and there was a calf born, which was also part of the publicity stunt. So Byrd deliberately took a pregnant cow with him in the hope that he would have the first cow born in Antarctica. Because of the weather and so forth, the ship was held up and that didn't happen. The cow wasn't born in Antarctica, just north of the Antarctic Circle, and that was a bull. And he survived, and 2 of the cows survived. One of them got frostbite and was shot some way through the expedition. But the other 3 came back and became major celebrities in America and were taken on what they called barnstorming tours and met the Secretary for Agriculture and went to big hotels in New York and were given hay cocktails and were feted. And as far as we could tell, went on to, live reasonably long and happy lives as far as, it went for a dairy cow at that stage. And certainly the bull, who in the dairy industry would normally have been killed as a very young calf, got a better deal than he would have done back in America. On the other hand, they did have to live for a year in a dairy without going outside. Half the year it would have been dark. It was pretty cold. I mean, it was heated. But they didn't get a lot of exercise or anything like that. So, it was not a pleasant experience. Introduced animals don't tend to have a good time in Antarctica for the most part.
And it's also a very high energy activity, turning, grain into milk. How did they feed them?
Yeah, so they had a deal with a grain company called Larrow. They took that feed down. They took down a lot of alfalfa. They just hauled it all down with them. I mean, which is, again, one of those questions was for us, well, why go to this bother? It seems like a huge amount of bother. And they insulated the barn with the feed. But it was hellish for the poor milkman trying to get it out every morning. It was hellish dealing with the manure as well. So the milkman had an awful time. We got hold of his diary, which is, I've got to say, it's a very tedious read, but it also makes you think it was not a very pleasant job. And he lived in the dairy with the cows. So, at least you knew that the temperatures were okay, because he had to, the person who was in charge of their welfare was also living in the same conditions. So, and to his, credit, he's not a very emotional man as far as his diary goes, but he gets pretty upset when Klondike, the cow with frostbite, looks like she's not going to recover, and he was quite teary when it came to shooting her. So, I think he certainly empathised with the cows.
So what does this tell us about the relationship between humans and animals, about colonialism? How do these things all interact?
Oh, that's a really big question, I think. Look, I think for me it was just a case of taking animals seriously in Antarctica, not treating them as some kind of little whimsical aside. That's how the cows had always been presented in accounts of the expedition, as this kind of surreal footnote to the story, which, it is a surreal story. But when you pay careful attention to their experiences, not only do you begin to come back to the animal's point of view, I think you also see human activity differently, and you begin to see, what work the cows were doing for humans in Antarctica at that time. So I guess for me, it's paying real attention to animals' experience can also make us understand human experience differently. They're not separate things.
But it's also interesting. It makes me think that animals, in a sense, are a bit of a prop to colonialisation. If we want
certainly that's. I mean, there's many books on that topic, but they don't tend to. I mean, Antarctica tends to get left out of those kinds of discussions because it's seen as being an exceptional place that, people don't talk about. Well, they're only just beginning to talk about Antarctica in terms of colonialism and post-colonialism. So I guess part of the project is bringing Antarctica back into those kinds of frames and thinking that we can actually look at human and animal activity in Antarctica in the same way that we can look at it elsewhere.
Well, Elle, I ask everyone who comes on the podcast to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Ready as I'll ever be.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Yeah, it seems like a long time ago now, but I'm thinking, so it was about, I was involved in the Considering Animals conference, which I think was 2007, and it was right before that I became interested from memory, and it was that conference that really got me interested. So it would have been things published around then, and it would have been literary, because I come from a literary studies background. So I think Nigel Rothfull's put out a collection a while before that called Representing Animals. Had articles by, I think, Steve Baker and Erica Fudge and people like that. So I think that would have been my first encounter. But Philip Armstrong's work as well And another thing I thought about was that the reaction series Animal was coming out at that point, and that fascinated me because I have degrees in science and literature, and those books, the way that they look at particular animal species from different disciplinary angles really appealed to me.
Yes.
So I think it was all those things together really at that stage,
Yeah, they certainly take animals very seriously, and
they
put them
do,
front and centre.
and it's not a one-dimensional thing. It's from all different perspectives, which really appeals to me. Yeah.
Well, a shout out to Philip, who's been a previous guest on the podcast.
Right.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Yeah, I think I can. I think it was based on a paper that I gave at that conference, Considering Animals, which was another co-authored piece. And it strikes me that a lot of my animal studies work is co-authored with a critic called Stephanie Fenningworth, who was a student of mine at the time, and we looked at penguin films. So if you recall, around that time, March the Penguins was a huge documentary about emperor penguins. And then Happy Feet, the children's animation. So we were interested in situating those films partly within a longer cultural history of penguins and looking at the way in which human perceptions of and attitudes towards penguins had changed, but also looking at their politics in a sense, particularly around environmentalism and climate change.
Wonderful. Well, if you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Yeah, I think thinking back, I think it's not so much a big theorist or someone that I've read, but the people who were around me when I became interested, people who were local to me, and I was very lucky to be in a kind of hotbed, I suppose, of animal studies. So Helen Tiffin would be a big one. Helen did a lot of work in post-colonial studies, and then towards the latter part of her career did a degree in zoology and then moved into working on animals. And she was at UTAS, where I'm based at the time. And did some co-authoring with me, and in fact she helped me with gave me some good advice on this cow piece. And I think the fact that she's interested in the scientific perspective as well as the humanities one really gelled with me. So she was a big influence, but also people like Carol Freeman, Yvette Watt, and Adrian Franklin was also at UTAS at the time. So for me, it was more that kind of local group of interested people that I could talk to than any remote scholar.
Yeah, well, who needs a big name international when you're at UTAS and you've got fabulous colleagues. So big shout out to both Yvette and Carol, who are both previous guests on the podcast. What's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. And I'm on a research fellowship, and I feel like I should say, more research. But what I really think is probably teaching, that we should be teaching animal studies, but also trying to include animal studies perspective in our general units, if you know what I mean. I think that when people come to university, they're at a stage when they're often reassessing the way they think about the world. And I think asking them to think really carefully about the assumptions they make in regard to their attitudes towards animals and their practices, I think without hectoring them, I think that's really important. Just making them think about their own beliefs can be really powerful. So I think that's the number one thing that academics can do. There's other things, of course.
Well, if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
And again, this is a really difficult question because at the same time there's a gazillion things and it's very hard to put your finger on any one. I think for me, empathy is probably key. I think looking back at my own life, I think that empathy is probably the key quality of my own that makes me think about animals perhaps differently to other people I know. So I think encouraging people to be empathetic, or maybe I'm being naive, but I think that would automatically lead on to changing practices and changing cruelty. So literature, I think, is one way of doing this because it does encourage you to look at different points of view. It's not always successful, and there are other ways of doing that, but I think the imagination is hugely important in regard to putting yourself into someone else's perspective or another creature's perspective. We always get accused of anthropomorphism when that happens, but I think it's hugely important to be able to make that imaginative leap.
Wonderful. Well, what are you working on next?
So I've got a I'm still in the Antarctic space. It's very much my thing. And I've got an article coming out that's one of my few non-Antarctic pieces. It's a chapter actually about animals and travel writing.
Oh,
so I've become interested in travel, and there's not a lot of work, or there's increasing amounts now, but there's still not a huge amount of work on animals and travel. So that's coming out in the Routledge. I've got to remember the name now. Routledge Companion to Travel Writing, I think it is.
Okay.
Should be out later this year. But also I'm writing a book called Travelling Ice about travel cultures and travel writing in regard to Antarctica, and I'd like animals to be a part of that, animal travel in regard to Antarctica, species on the move, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And lastly, I think I'd like to do some more work with Hanne. We're interested in, there's a whole rich history of animals in Antarctica that I think has yet to be fully explored. And one thing we're interested in is Macquarie Island and the penguin harvesting that went on there a century ago. So we might write something about that, but there's also a whole series of other historical moments that I think we'd like to unpack.
Wonderful. Well, it sounds like you've got plenty to keep you going.
Yeah, that's right.
How can people find out more about your work?
They can just look at my website at UTAS, just put my name in and UTAS and I'll come up, or and Hanne's as well, of course. Or I've got a site with the Australasian Animal Studies Association as well.
Right.
So that's another way. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Well, Ellie, thank you so much for joining us for Knowing Animals.
It's been a pleasure.
And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, a podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals, or to like us on Facebook at Knowing Animals. Finally, don't forget to leave a review. Reviews make it easier for other people to find us. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.